You ready? I'm here with Professor Tim Bale. Welcome back to another episode of where we discuss everything politics. So Tim, we have an election going on right now. What do you think are some of the factors that could determine the outcome of the election?
Well, obviously Brexit is going to be a big one as far as the Conservatives are concerned. That's what they want the election to be about completely. And as for Labour, they want a rather different narrative around public services. Their manifesto's just been released today. It's a big spending manifesto, I think 135 billion worth of spending, which is almost twice as much as they promised last time, and last time was quite a radical manifesto. Tories, of course, are offering to spend quite a lot as well because they want to make sure that they don't suffer the same fate as they did in 2017, when I think some of Labour's promises resonated and the Conservatives still look like fans of austerity. They need to move away from that. So I think Brexit and public spending are obviously the big ones.
Right. And how much do you think the polls affect voting behaviour?
Well, there's actually quite a lot of research on this. Some political scientists think that opinion polling can create what they call a bandwagon effect. So in other words, as people see that one side is going to win, they like to jump on that bandwagon and vote for the winner. There's not a great deal of evidence to say that that's a big factor, actually. Some people suggest that at the last election in 2017, for example, the fact that most people thought that Labour couldn't possibly win and that Jeremy Corbyn wasn't very popular meant that they could take a punt on or a risk on Labour that they otherwise wouldn't have taken.
Yeah.
So I guess it can work both ways. I'd say, more generally, that I think, polls are a kind of indicator of where public opinion is. I'm not sure that they drive people's votes that much, apart possibly, and this is relevant to this election, when it comes to marginal seats and tactical voting. Because obviously, if you do get a local poll which tells you, the position a few weeks out from the election, you'll at least be in a better position to, vote tactically. And of course, if you're looking to vote for a candidate who's going to stop Brexit or is going to do Brexit, that might be relevant to you. So I suppose, those local opinion polls, they could make a difference.
As you touched on marginal seats and tactical voting with the rise of the SNP and other smaller parties. Do you think there's a case to be made for electoral reform, especially since these smaller parties have gained an increase of the voting shares?
Yeah, I mean, electoral reform would be an interesting one for the SNP, actually, because the SNP in some ways benefits from the first past the post system. Because its vote is concentrated in Scotland, it can get, a very low percentage of the total UK vote, but still get 40, 50 seats in Parliament. The smaller parties that are really disadvantaged by the electoral system are obviously the Lib Dems and the Greens, and to some extent UKIP were, and the Brexit Party would be as well. I think, from my point of view, I think we do need to move to electoral reform and to some form of proportional representation, simply because it seems to me we do actually have a multi-party system, but it can't really, if you like, be born properly because it's being constrained by this first-past-the-post electoral system that we have. I mean, there's a fairly wide variety of opinion in this country that isn't clearly reflected, back there in the House of Commons. And I think it probably, should be. I also think there's an argument to say that, coalition government, does reflect a slightly wider slew of opinion, and therefore, is all the better for that. And I think it can encourage cross-party working and a more consensual form of politics. So for all those reasons, I would be in favour of it. The problem is we had a referendum on electoral reform back in 2011, which failed miserably, and it's difficult to see us replaying that, I think, anytime soon, unless one or other of the two main parties thinks it's in their interest to do so, and I doubt very much whether they'll ever think that that's the case.
Yeah. Touching on the main parties, Labour and Conservative, and the difference in the leadership style and the clear ideological shift by both parties, Labour to the left, or some would argue far left, and the Conservatives going towards the right, or even some would argue going a bit towards the left, because they're especially in this election, focusing on the public sector due to the austerity claims. What do you think has led to this ideological shift?
Well, I mean, I think to some extent it is to do with the pendulum swinging back from austerity, as you hinted. I think there are many, even on the Conservative side, who think that things went a little bit too far, and in fact, they choked off growth and investment in the economy, and certainly have eroded some public services, particularly the health service, and particularly education, and therefore something needs to be done about that. So, I mean, I think the move of the Conservatives into the centre on public spending isn't simply electorally driven. I think they realise that there are serious problems there, although I do think they are worried about getting caught electorally if they don't do something about that. As far as the Labour Party are concerned, I mean, clearly it's got to do with austerity as well. It's got to do with the fact that many in the Labour Party thought that the Labour Party under Ed Miliband hadn't really done enough to distinguish itself from the Conservative Party, and therefore shouldn't be surprised when it didn't win the 2015 election.
Even that Ed Miliband stage, that was considered by some even too left-wing.
Yes, it was by some, but I think for Labour Party members and some Labour Party MPs, particularly on the left, I think they regarded Ed Miliband's regime as a little bit cowardly. They believed that it should have really taken on the Tories, and that it lost the 2015 election because there was insufficient difference between Labour and the Conservatives. So I think that really is the kind of diagnosis that a lot of people on the left made, and therefore when they got the chance, when Jeremy Corbyn won the 2015 Labour leadership contest, they moved the party to the left.
And what do you think the outcome of the election is going to be?
That is a tricky one.
From a neutral perspective?
Yeah, of course.
From a person who also has ideological beliefs, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, that is a tricky one. I mean, I think you'd have to say, if you look at the lead that the Conservative Party has opened up on the Labour Party, it is a very big lead right now. We're 3 or so weeks out from the election. If you look at the way that the Labour Party, quote unquote, caught the Tories up in 2017, that had already begun to happen, and it was happening faster than it does seem to be happening now. So I suspect that there isn't time for Labour to catch up. Also, if you look at the more sort of fundamental non-headline polling, you see that the Conservatives are a long way ahead of Labour on leadership. Boris Johnson is much more popular than Jeremy Corbyn. He's not that popular, but Jeremy Corbyn is so unpopular that that there is a big gap there, and that does seem to make a difference to voters. And they also seem to be regarded, rightly or wrongly, as more competent on the economy than the Labour Party. And if you put leadership and economic competence together, and you've got a lead on both of those, then normally you will win the election. Now, the caveat, of course, is Brexit. There are clearly some people who might otherwise vote Tory who don't want Brexit, might vote for Lib Dems in some areas, and that might damage them. They may lose some seats in Scotland, and some of the seats that they need to win, to win a big majority or to win any majority, they have to take directly off Labour. And that might not be as easy as people think. People tend to talk about these kind of Labour leave seats, but you have to remember, as I'm sure you know, that most people who voted Labour in those seats voted to remain in the European Union. They don't necessarily want to leave the EU. So I think the Conservatives have probably got slightly more problems than their opinion poll lead at the moment indicates. However, if you put everything together, I think it's quite difficult right now, and of course things can change, to see why the Tories would lose this election.
And touching on the Brexit and the referendum that we had in 2016, why do you think it's democratic to have a new election on a consistent basis?
Yeah, to have a new referendum, you mean? Yeah.
To have a new election.
Oh, right.
We have a fixed term Parliament Act that came into effect, but it's considered by some as anti-democratic to have more than one referendum on one particular issue.
Yeah, I mean, I would say to that, I can understand that because the referendum was presented as in out, do or die. However, I don't think democracy is an event, it is a process. If it can be discovered that people have changed their mind, or if what you've promised to do in a referendum looks far more difficult than first envisaged, I think it's only fair really to consult people again. I mean, the same applies in some ways to general elections. We don't have one general election, then it's over forever.
Yeah.
So it's 3 years down the line now. There does seem to be a slight shift in public opinion. We do at least know now what we're voting for, and I think that's the important thing, really. I think one of the problems of the 2016 referendum was that people weren't voting in that referendum with any clear idea of what Brexit involved. They have got that clear idea now, and so why not give them a chance to either endorse the deal that Boris Johnson's come up with or reject it and remain. And I suppose when Remainers say, well, what are you so frightened of, Leavers? If you thought you were going to win this referendum, you'd have another one. They might have a point there.
But I guess that's a good point you touched on, actually. I know a lot of Labour supporters who have voted for Brexit, and they're kind of alienated by Labour's position on the whole issue.
I mean, I think that's why Jeremy Corbyn has decided to sit on the fence. I mean, whether that's been a good plan for the Labour Party or not, I think is another matter. I mean, I myself suspect that it might have been better for Labour to move to a more kind of Remainy position rather earlier than it did. And that actually Labour's position is, for some people, either one thing nor the other, and quite confusing. And that's clearly something that the Tories are pressing on, and Boris Johnson pressed on it during the leaders' debate.
What do you think of the rise of social media in political discussions, and how much do you think it actually impacts on the elections?
I mean, I think it could be overdone. I mean, I don't think Twitter makes a massive amount of difference because not that many people are on Twitter.
Yeah.
I think Facebook, has more power, and that's presumably why parties spend so much money on it. That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting because I think it advantages the Conservatives in the sense that they've often got more money to spend on it, but Labour has the advantage in the sense that it is better able, because it's got a bigger membership and a younger membership, to produce, if you like, more organic content that people actually want to share, that isn't this sort of top-down stuff.
For the younger audience.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, I'm not sure that the rise of social media necessarily benefits one side rather than another. I mean, it's also obviously inevitable. I mean, you can complain about the effect of social media, but look, it's here to stay. I mean, when I say it can be overstated, I think we have to remember that the vast majority of people still get most of their political information, in as much as they are interested in politics, from the TV. And actually, I think we're very lucky in this country to have, a balanced broadcast media that, it can be criticised by both sides, but essentially tries as hard as it can to be as fair as it can. And I think that's very good for the democratic process. When I was younger, people used to worry a lot about the newspapers, less so now, of course, because their circulations are dropping. And actually, there was never that much evidence to suggest that newspapers could actually win or lose an election for you in any case.
And Labour's nationalisation of Labour's policy on nationalisation and public ownership, which is a radical programme, a complete transformation of this country and certain industries such as broadband and the rails and other sectors. Because we had nationalisation after the Clement Attlee government from 1945 to 1951, and then we saw the failures of it in the 1970s. What makes it different this time that they see it as a success route?
Well, I mean, good question. It's interesting. I mean, Conservatives privatised industries that weren't necessarily failing. I mean, I think it would be difficult to argue that water or electricity generation or gas transmission was actually failing in this country. I mean, I think they were more ideological and revenue-raising measures rather than, examples of nationalised industries that had failed. I think, the nationalisation of British Telecom, as it was then, clearly I think was something that worked, partly because it came about at the same time as technological innovation, and I'm not sure that a publicly owned telephonic sector would have adopted as that new technology as quickly as perhaps it did. And I think competition was quite useful in that respect. It'd be difficult to argue, I think, that rail nationalisation has been a total success. Privatisation has been a total success, but nationalisation, would it make it any better? Who knows? I mean, I'm a commuter. I mean, I can rail against railway companies like the best of them, but I'm not absolutely sure the state would run it any better than they do. I mean, I think, to be honest, it's kind of horses for courses really on nationalisation. You can make an argument that some industries, might benefit from public ownership, or at least, tougher regulation. And I suppose if I, was world king, I would probably wonder whether some of the money that was going to be spent on nationalisation could be spent elsewhere, and whether the job it's intended to do could be done by a much tougher regulation rather than actually by going as far as to take things into public ownership. But that's just me.
Yeah. I guess it's a radical transformation program, I guess.
Yeah, it is. And of course, if you're on the left, it's about more than just efficiency. It's about actually the structure of the state, and it's about reining back capitalism. Yeah.
How much of the public perception and the way they're going to vote on each selected parties comes down to ideological beliefs, whether you believe in the individual or whether you believe in society as a whole?
Right. I mean, I think people do have some fairly basic beliefs that could be ideological, on the extent to which the market should run things or the state should run things. And they play a part in people's voting decisions. But people's voting decisions are incredibly complex. I mean, we are all individuals, and in fact, none of us even really know why we do what we do. And I often laugh, when I see opinion polls ask people, why do you vote the way you do, or what's going to decide the way you vote, and people give an answer. I mean, I'm not sure that we any of us really understand that quite kind of mystical process. I think it's just a lot of things feed into a voting decision. So yeah, ideological reasons make a difference. I think whether you trust a particular party or a particular leader makes a big difference. I think obviously there's an extent to which whether you feel a particular party's policies are going to make you better off and your family better off makes a difference. You're going to judge their records in the past. You're going to think about what they may or may not do in the future. I mean, there's so many things that feed into people's political decisions. So we kind of can get somewhere near to think to knowing why people do what they do, but we can't be absolutely sure. And I don't think actually, although people like to say this, social class has entirely disappeared either. I mean, there is still a link, albeit not as strong as there once was, between people's class position, if you like, and the way that they vote, and that's not gone away utterly.
So we still live in a system that's divided by class?
Well, we still live in a system that's divided by class, and to some extent that still makes a difference to the way that people vote. Although at the last election, it has to be said, it seems to have made much less of a difference than, for example, age or education. And if you're looking for two things that really do seem to distinguish, one set of voters from the other, it's how old they are. At the last election, Labour won a majority of those under 47, I think it was, and the Conservatives won a majority of those over. And whether you've been to university makes a very big difference because it tends to be associated with a kind of cultural liberalism, particularly a kind of a kind of relaxed attitude on immigration that people who haven't been to university don't have, and that does make a difference to the way that people vote.
And lastly, should voting become mandatory?
Well, you have touched on something that I actually believe should be the case, but makes me very unpopular. I think, if you were to ask people in an opinion poll whether they agree with that, they'd say absolutely not. It's their freedom to, not to vote.
But in this country, when you don't let's say your kids are absent from school, you get a written warning.
Well,
you know?
you're right. I mean, there are certain obligations of citizenship, and we decide what those are. And one of them could be voting. And we know that there are some countries. I mean, Australia is an example where they do make voting compulsory. I mean, the reason I think that it is a good idea is because participation in elections is very, very heavily skewed towards older people and towards people from a higher social class. And I think that means that we risk politics and indeed Parliament being very, very unrepresentative. Now, you can say, well, it's up to young people if they want more say, to vote themselves, or if poorer people want more say, they should go out and vote themselves. But there are kind of reasons why young people feel that it's not worth it, and reasons why and why poor people, just sort of, don't get up there and do it. But they are two very, very important constituencies in this country, and I think their views need to be taken into account. And if we have to make it compulsory, and we can think about how we would sanction people who don't vote. I mean, I'm not suggesting we throw people in prison.
Although maybe that's a push we need now.
Well, I think that might be going a little bit too far. I mean, in most countries with compulsory voting, what happens is that you lose your right to claim certain benefits, or there's a small fine.
Which is fair. Yes.
Yeah. So to me, I think it would be a good move, but it would be a very unpopular move, and as such, I think it's very unlikely that the government will ever do it.
And that's about it, to be honest. Okay. Thanks for joining us today, Tim.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.
Okay.
That's actually it, to be honest.
Good.